Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Ana Huna. I'm here today with author N.S.Nuseibeh. N.S.Nuseibeh is a British-Palestinian writer and researcher born and raised in East Jerusalem. Her interests include issues around identity, ethics, inequality, and education. She has previously written for The Atlantic and been shortlisted for the Commonwealth Short Story Prize. Her latest book, Namesake, won the Giles St. Auburn Award, first prize, as a work in progress. Thank you today for joining me.
Thank you so much for having me.
Of course. And just to begin, I'd like to say we invited you here today to speak to us about your new book, Namesake. And I'd just like to begin by asking you, it's a very poignant and a very personal set of essays that you've compiled here. So I wanted to ask what began to motivate you to write them.
Yeah, so just to give a bit of context, I should probably say that these essays use the figure of Nusayba bint Ka'ab, who is the 7th century warrior woman from whom my family supposedly descends, as a kind of doorway through which to explore kind of a range of different subjects. So what motivated me, I guess I've always loved the way that the essay form can kind of probe and stretch a subject without necessarily coming up with like firm answers. And I'm a big fan of contemporary essayists like Kathy Park Hong or Rebecca Solnit, Elaine Castillo. I wanted to do something similar to what they do in their writing, but bringing in Arab Muslim culture. So when I first envisaged the book, I guess I saw it as a way to maybe bring Islamic history into the present and as a way to kind of bring my type of maybe cultural, secular, feminist approaches to Islam kind of into the Western consciousness a bit more.
Absolutely. Yeah, I definitely, whilst reading it, saw the almost inspiration of the various sort of personal narrative essays that we've been seeing a lot in the market recently. You touched upon how this was a way to bring sort of Arab Islamic culture to the Western audience or a Western audience. So can you walk us through the main themes throughout the book and what you were aiming to emphasize in these essays?
Sure. So the collection kind of weaves together, Islamic history, but also kind of Palestinian politics, as you said, personal essay, and kind of cultural criticism. And it's all tied together by this figure of Nusayba bint Ka'ab, this warrior woman who fought alongside the Prophet Muhammad and was one of the first converts to Islam. So I kind of use her, this character, and the stories that we have of her from the hadith, the traditions about the Prophet, as a kind of jumping off point to explore a variety of topics, things like anxiety, anger, superheroes even, motherhood. So for instance, like in one of the essays, I look at a story about Nusayba in which she fasts inexplicably outside of Ramadan and prepares a meal for the Prophet Muhammad. And I was fascinated by this story because not only is it somehow incongruous, the story about the warrior woman making a meal and fasting instead of like being out on the battlefield, it also seemed a beautiful example of how complex food, cooking, eating, feeding, fasting can be. The fact that despite being crucial to preserving culture and family, cooking and feeding have been, generally speaking, part of the domestic and therefore feminine sphere, while at the same time, female appetite is eyed with suspicion. Women have to be like small, not take up too much space. So in that essay, I explore this tension, the fact that Palestinian food is very important to me because it's part of preserving a culture that's under attack, but somehow underneath it, there's also this layer of like normative femininity around cooking that makes me uncomfortable. And yeah, it's Nusayba's story that kind of kicks it all off.
It's, one of the things I noticed, I mean, this is the main narrative driver is Nusayba's stories. And I noticed in the very beginning, you have a quote from Fatima Mernissi. And so I was wondering, how much did you draw from pre-existing methodologies in feminist theory and feminist literature, specifically Arab feminist literature? And moreover, what exactly you sought to explore, as you mentioned a little bit, through food and culture and feminism through Nusayba's historical figure. In essence, in other words, what does this methodology offer us?
Yeah, so a lot of those feminist scholars they mentioned, like Mernisi, for example, used a kind of contextualist approach, which involved like examining and critiquing the hadith, looking at chains of transmission and things like that. And I definitely didn't do that. It wasn't really my intention. I mean, although I was also interested in the context and in contextualization, making sense of the hadith in terms of its historical and social context. I approached the hadith more as stories and tried to find out what I could in terms of research about what life looked like at the time in Arabia, particularly, for women, so as to bring this figure of Nusayba to life as much as possible. I mean, I guess what I wanted from that whole thing was just to bring the distant past a little closer and maybe make ancient Islam a little easier to see. But also, as I mentioned earlier, just kind of find aspects of her character that either resonated or jarred with contemporary values and ideas. I think that's what the methodology offers. Like, for instance, the fact that she's said to have gone into battle with her sons, that she encouraged them to fight, that brought up a lot of questions for me about what motherhood looks like, about what good motherhood looks like, about what good motherhood looks like in times of conflict or while under oppression, which I think is both specific to me, but also hopefully a more general question that might resonate with others thinking about like, what does parenting look like today?
Absolutely. And I think, considering everything that's happening in the region, I think that's a central question is what does parenting look like today? What do gender norms look like today when survival itself is under stress?
Exactly.
I'm thinking, so in presenting these stories taken from Nusayba, sort of linking it to the present, you mentioned what your goal was a little bit, which was to bring a different culture to a Western audience. But did you have other goals? Was self-reflecting or contributing back knowledge a goal? And how exactly do you see the responsibility of the writer, of the author, in this context?
Ooh, tough question. I've never, as a reader, I've never really been someone who's drawn to like big impersonal nonfiction tomes. I prefer stories about people like memoirs and novels and like the personal essay form, as I said. And I guess the personal essay form allows you to kind of investigate a topic, whatever it is, but also be intimate with that investigation, as you say, sort of reveal personal stories. If I'm honest, I actually did want to avoid the personal as much as possible when I first started. But what I found was that like in thinking about Nusayba and the questions that she provoked, things like the glorification of violence, for instance, which as a warrior is kind of part and parcel, I couldn't get away from my own personal context, I guess what I mean is that growing up as a Palestinian in occupied East Jerusalem is, it's a particular complex experience, and it kind of necessarily informed the way that I took on the investigation of my ancestor, and so it informed the way that I reflected on all of the topics.
Mm-hmm. And then lastly, I'd like to ask a bit of a broader question and a bit less specific to the book, but I'd like to ask you about how the book touches, as you mentioned, a lot of evergreen topics related to women's rights, gender equality, in particular, as you mentioned, motherhood. And so, amongst this myriad of themes and issues, how would you characterize what you viewed as sort of the most pressing issue for women in the region today? How did you capture it in the book? And moreover, and this is a slightly different question, but what strategies do you see as offering women resilience and momentum to change either their big life world or their more intimate life worlds?
Well, I don't feel like I can speak for the whole sort of Swana region as a whole, but I would say that the most pressing issue for Palestinian women today is the Israeli occupation. It's true that Palestinian women face difficulties within Palestinian society, women everywhere face difficulties under patriarchy. But Nawal al-Saadawi put it best when she said, and this was, I think, back in the 80s, how can we speak of liberation for Palestinian women without speaking of their right to have a land on which to live? You know, the rights of Palestinian women are denied largely not by Palestinian men, but by the occupying power. And the occupation itself also kind of confounds efforts at female liberation, because any feminist movements are kind of inevitably tied to and sometimes restrained by the need for national liberation. So the most pressing need is a peaceful, just solution to the conflict that will enable Palestinian society as a whole to flourish freely. That's my answer.
No, thank you for your answer and for your time today. I really appreciate you taking, the time to talk to me about your book and more. Once again, thanks to you, thanks to the audience for another episode of Ana Huna. I'm Faria Nasruddin. Thank you.